One of the most curious things that we've already seen in our study of First Corinthians has to do with the matters of social status in this Corinthian church. For example, we see in Romans chapter 16, which is written from Corinth, that Erastus, the city's director of public works, is a member of this Corinthian congregation, showing that there's at least one person of means. And throughout chapters 1 through 4, we see this addiction to status and rhetoric and kingly leadership sort of behavior that would lead us to assume that there are people of nobility, people of a higher status in this church. So it's strange when we get to chapters 5 and 6 that there are curious and some rather disgusting behaviors happening in this church. In chapter 5, a man is having an incestuous relationship with his stepmother. And then in chapter 6, members of this church are suing one another. Well, how do we make sense of what kinds of people might have the ability to find themselves in those situations? Well, I believe in order to responsibly answer that question, we have to know something about what was called the patron-client system of the ancient world. And let us start by actually looking at some inscriptions, some pieces of archaeology that might illuminate for us how this system worked. If you go to Italy, Greece, Ephesus, the hotbeds of the ancient Greco-Roman world, you will see inscriptions like this literally by the hundreds in towns and by the thousands across the ancient Roman Empire. This is one inscription to a local patron in the town of Athens, Greece, and it simply says, "The people and the young honor Aristoxenos, son of Demophon." I know it seems like it's no big deal, and in fact, if you went there, you would see so many of these inscriptions that you would bore of them in a short period of time. This is a statue base in the city of Rome, capital of the world at that time. It would have had a statue of the honoree on the top. And it says, Glabrio, patron of the colony of the Acilius family, gave this gift for the health of Caesar Augustus. So Glabrio had apparently had a statue erected of Caesar Augustus in his honor, and so he was honored with this inscription on the base. Let's switch gears for a second, and then we'll come back to why these statues are important. If you were to draw a chart illustrating the classes of American society, you would have most likely a pie chart in which you had a few people in the upper class, a relatively small number of people in the lower class, and the bulk of people in between. The ancient world was not like that at all. Instead, in the ancient world, you had the very peak upper classes, not really a middle class, so to speak of, but then the majority of people in the lower class. And the lower class at this time meant that you lived at the subsistence level. You were most likely a small farmer just trying to survive. We know a lot from ancient skeletal remains that chronic malnourishment was the norm for people who were not in that top tier upper class. Scholars would suggest that perhaps 10% of the population was upper, 90% lower, and the 10% controlled something like 50 to 60% of the wealth and resources of the ancient world. So because of the inequality of this system, the Greco-Roman system of what was called patron-client relationships allowed resources to move from the top to the bottom of the social pyramid. It was the patron's job to amass the right number and the right kind of clients. And when they had clients under them, the patrons would give to them goods, food, games, loans, protection, all the things that caused their clients to honor them with inscriptions such as we looked at before. And clients would give to their patrons honor. They would watch their patrons back. They would praise their patron publicly, and sometimes they would group together, especially if patrons were patron over an entire community, and they would give great statues to the patron. What does this have to do with 1 Corinthians? Well, a New Testament scholar named John Chow, back in the 1990s, wrote a book arguing that the main problem in Corinth is that there is a patron, or perhaps two, who are expecting to bring their patronage and this system into the church. For example, someone seems above the law sexually. In 1 Corinthians 5, it was against Roman law to have an incestual relationship with one's stepmother, and yet the Corinthians are boasting about this man. Why would they not be boasting about him if he were not a prominent person, perhaps a patron? Also, in chapter 6, someone is making use of the Corinthian court system, which was reserved for the wealthy only. The poor masses could not make use of the courts. We see in chapter 11 that the Lord's Supper has become a feast for the wealthier members, those who can come early and drink wine and eat sumptuous foods. And then finally, most curiously, in chapter 9, Paul will not take financial support from the Corinthians. This is not the case in all of his churches, but for Corinth, he says no. And is it not perhaps because he does not want to receive money from a patron, for the reason that the patron might assume that Paul is coming under him as his client? So just a little bit of background knowledge that helps illuminate the dynamics that we see beginning in 1 Corinthians chapter 5.